stories to be told, treasures to be found, silver and gold, dollars and pounds, never worth more than the stories of a town.
The battle to save the Franklin River remains the most dramatic environmental struggle in Australian history. It was a seminal moment both in Australian politics and the Green movement. And the focal point of this struggle was a small town called Strahan in Macquarie Harbour on the west coast of Tasmania. This is Hell's Gate, the treacherous entrance to Macquarie Harbour. Hundreds of vessels have foundered here as the roaring 40s drove them onto the harsh west coast. This harbour is virtually the only safe haven along the entire coastline.
The first recorded European arrival through here was James Kelly in 1815. He and his companions spent 3 days exploring and mapping the harbour. They noted the local Aboriginals flushing out wildlife using fire. But what really caught their attention was the amount of timber available. It was the prisoners that named this entrance Hell's Gate. The convicts that were brought here were repeat offenders, the worst of the worst. Welcome to hell.
Macquarie Harbour is 5 times the size of Sydney Harbour. All the prisoners here were sent to a convict settlement on one small island in the midst of the harbour. Lieutenant Governor William Sorrell's express instructions were constant, active, unremitting employment of every individual in very hard labour is the grand and main design of this settlement.
Way back in 1822, it's hard to imagine a more remote place to drag these poor souls than here at Sarah Island. There was no fresh water for a start. That had to be obtained over at Phillip Island, about 6 kilometres away. The soil was poor, you couldn't grow anything, and the only escape was back out through Hell's Gate or into the impenetrable, unexplored wilderness.
89 men slept in 3 rooms of this penitentiary. The written accounts talk of a thin gruel they were fed in the morning and the long days engaged in back-breaking work through freezing rain and wind and the legendary harsh treatment by the overseers. During its 11 years, nearly 1,200 prisoners served time here.
On the northern side of the island here are the remnants of slipways and wharves, because one of the stunning achievements of the convict workforce here was in shipbuilding. 120 ships were built here, and to give you an idea of the scale, in 1828 it was the busiest shipyard in Australia. The key was that Strahan and the surrounds of Macquarie Harbour were covered with a tall, straight, durable timber. Not just any timber. This timber was like the holy grail for lumber yards all over the world. Tasmania's very own Huon Pine.
The reason that the Huon Pine is so sought after is that it's straight, relatively free of knots, flexible and incredibly durable. It was the perfect timber for the emerging colony's much-needed fleet of ships.
The Huon Pine can only be found in Tasmania. It's the second oldest growing tree in the world. We're talking 1 to 2 millimetres in width a year, which makes this gem about 1,000 years old, only halfway through its lifespan, middle-aged really. And the only reason it's here is the loggers left it because it's got a big kink in it. Magic though.
Felling of Huon Pine ended in the 1960s. Occasionally though, logs from the bygone era of the piners are washed out in a flood, like this one outside Morrison's sawmill. Snowy Morrison's father and grandfather were both piners. His mill on the wharf at Strahan is a local institution.
They used to go in for 4 and 5 months at a time. They used a punt to take their supplies and all up the river, you see. And then they set up camp. They relied on the floods to get the logs out. When the floods came, they washed down the river, you see. Well, it was the world's best boat building timber because of the oil in it. The oil preserves it. It's a beautiful, beautiful wood to work too, you know. Any of the furniture makers and wood turners and boat builders, they all speak highly of it because it cuts so good with their tools and things, you see. We get most of ours from the Gordon River where it floods out during the winter. So it's all up in World Heritage areas now. There's still enough on the forest floor to keep the industry going for quite a number of years.
Ships had been depositing convicts and collecting Huon Pine around Macquarie Harbour for decades before Strahan took shape. But it was the rich mineral discoveries along the west coast here and the impressive network of railway lines built to service the mines in Zeehan and Queenstown that really shaped the port of Strahan.
Mount Lyell Mining built the railway line in 1896 to get copper concentrates from Queenstown to the port at Strahan. The line closed in 1963, and then, in an amazing $30 million restoration project, the line between Strahan and Queenstown was reopened 40 years later in 2003. Now the freight is tourists. They arrive to visit the Western Tasmania Wilderness National Park, a national park that, despite meeting more criteria than any other World Heritage area on Earth, was nearly lost.
In 1979, the Tasmanian Hydro Commission released a report to construct a 180 megawatt power station which would result in the inundation of 37 kilometres of the Gordon River Valley and another 33 kilometres of the Franklin River Valley. Now this scheme was to add to the huge power output of the state's 23 other power stations. Not everyone thought this was necessary.
In 1981, a referendum was held in an attempt to resolve the issue. The Tasmanian people were asked to choose between the Gordon below Franklin or the Gordon above Olga scheme. The option of no dams was withdrawn. A staggering 44% of the votes cast were informal. Most had no dams written across the ballot ticket. The state election in 1982 saw the new Premier, Robin Gray, describe the Franklin River as nothing but a brown ditch, leech-ridden and unattractive to the majority of people. The state government ignored a World Heritage listing, revoked parts of the Wild Rivers National Park, and paved the way for the development of the Gordon below Franklin power scheme. The political battle appeared lost. The Franklin River blockade commenced in December 1982. 2,613 people registered at the Wilderness Society headquarters in Strahan to participate in the campaign of non-violent civil disobedience. Overnight, the population of Strahan had increased tenfold. Diane Coon was one of them.
We're in the Customs House here in Strahan, and in the early 1980s, this room and the flats at the back were loaned to the people from the Wilderness Society who were here starting the conservation battle for the blockade. And it was used to make some of those big posters and banners that became kind of emblematic of that campaign. The whole campaign was very divisive for the town. It's a very hard time for people It divided families. Every meeting, every collection in the pub, every council meeting had, people arguing. The wharves is where the headquarters of the Hydroelectric Commission was, so people who wanted to show their support would come down there with their own banners, and people supporting the dam tended to associate themselves with large machines, so it's quite interesting theatre, and that was all going on very close to the wharf. What this campaign did better than any other before, and I'd argue since, is it sold this area to Middle Australia by making them fall in love with it with fabulous photographs. The iconic photograph is the one of Rock Island Bend, which was used on the front pages of the newspapers in Melbourne and Sydney and Canberra with a tagline that says, "Could you vote for a party who would destroy this?" And to this day, anybody over age 35 sees that image and stands with all sorts of recognition. What this campaign did better than any is say, "Isn't this place beautiful? Don't you reckon we should save it?" And so the images, were it not for the great work of the photographers, I think the job of the conservationists in communicating in words would have been that much harder.
Finally, after a federal election and a High Court battle, where a 4-3 majority ruling was given, the dam was stopped. The World Heritage Area now covers 20% of the state of Tasmania, and Strahan remains the gateway to this beautiful wilderness.